So ever since AMD and Intel split into two separate entities back in the days of disco and free love, we're bad with timelines, AMD, barring a few exceptions, has always been the underdog to Intel's jacked up pit bull. That's just the way the cookie crumbled. But with Intel's almost complete dominance in the CPU market, that came with more than a fair bit of complacency. Complacency that really started biting them in the silicone butt in this new chapter of the newly exciting rivalry. So in this video, we'll be taking a quick look at just how dominant a force Intel really was, as well as their belief that they were basically untouchable, and how that all changed and continues to change thanks to Ryzen. And in the spirit of the recently concluded Computex, we'll be doing it all through the eyes of Computex's past. So Computex is a tech mecca where the who's who in the tech world all get together every year to unveil their new products or show off what their current lineups can do, to talk about and show many of their exciting projects that they're working on, and sometimes take jabs at the competition. That makes it a pretty great place to examine Intel's slightly insulting complacency and subsequent staggered fall from grace. But first, we do well to remember that Intel didn't always have a commanding lead over AMD. That's right, there was a time where AMD was the one to beat and Intel was struggling to keep up. It seems almost like a distant reality, but it was indeed a reality. Ars Technica published a wonderfully informative and comprehensive article on AMD's early supremacy, which you should really check out, links in the description. But the gist of it is this. Back during his first stint at AMD, the legendary Jim Keller helped AMD produce the Athlon 64 desktop part, as well as the Opteron server chips, both of which proved far superior to anything Intel had up their sleeves. The server side of things were especially good to AMD, with their Opteron chips helping the company amass around a 25% market share by 2006. Compare that to the video I did just yesterday where they have 1% market share, or they did last year. But after spending many years at the top of the performance charts, there was a change in the air as Intel planned one of the biggest comebacks in tech history. Bigger than when the Patriots beat the Falcons. How can you lose in a Super Bowl when you're up 28-3? So this comeback by Intel came in the form of the enhanced Pentium M processor, or more specifically, the Intel Core series that was derived from the Pentium M parts. The Core family was born in 2006, and thanks to their high performance and greater efficiency amongst other things, Intel gained more traction than ever before and just never really stopped, stomping out AMD like Thanos or something. Now let's jump ahead a couple of years. So back in 2015, Intel was sitting pretty. They still boasted some of the fastest chips around, and they knew it. They were so profoundly comfortable with their dominance in the CPU market that they felt little need to change things up and give consumers something they haven't really had access to before. This meant that the average consumer, you and me, got stiffed again with the Broadwell architecture. The Broadwell CPUs were about as iterative gets, offering mostly the same core and thread counts as we had on Haswell and even Ivy Bridge before that. Sure, Broadwell improved in the clock speed and IPC department and did bring some minor new features to the table, but it was basically Broadwell with a little kick. The blame doesn't rest solely on Intel though. If AMD posed any real threat to Intel's CPU market share, the blue team would have had no choice but to come up with something a little more innovative than another 14nm refresh. Instead, what we got from AMD was the lackluster Carrizo and Godavari APUs built on inferior process tech, and that ran hotter than all of us when we were in Taiwan last week. That's super hot, in case you're wondering, because I've never seen these guys sweat so much. So Intel felt so unchallenged and set in their ways that they actually resorted to mocking their competition for showing off real innovation. Yeah, you're gonna see the foreshadowing strong with this one. At Computex 2015, MediaTek announced a brand new mobile processor with 3 processor clusters, making for a 10-core chip it believed would revolutionize mobile processors. That didn't really happen, and smartphones haven't really gotten to a point where they need all that many cores, but it was something new and exciting, if a bit underwhelming. Intel's response to this was to mock its competitors with a quad-core Zenfone with a 61-core Xeon Phi coprocessor stuck to its back. Along with that, the company implied that its rivals should be less concerned with adding more cores to the equation and more with optimizing for fewer cores. This was also a jab at AMD because they were adding more compute cores with the APUs, and it was just a whole big, you guys suck and we don't. So whether they were right about that or not, which they sort of were, that wasn't the point. The point was that Intel was on top, and any sort of innovation from other companies was to be mocked because they're still not as good as what Intel could do. So Computex 2016 was arguably a little more interesting CPU-wise than 2015, as Intel introduced the Broadwell E high-end desktop part. These brought more cores and threads to the desktop platform than we'd seen up to that point, and had the potential to be hugely exciting, except they weren't, at least not to the average consumer. Along with all of the cores and threads you could have possibly wanted at the time, and a few other legitimately useful features came with massive price tags. These parts were by no means geared towards the general population. They were built for professionals who really needed each and every one of the processor's new features and didn't mind paying a huge premium for the privilege of owning one. We're talking about 10 core CPUs, just so we're aware here, which in current talk is not a whole lot. So on the actual desktop front, Intel launched another optimized 14 nanometer processor family known as Skylake, which again failed to bring more cores to consumers at a price that made any kind of sense. In the meantime, AMD whetted appetites for their upcoming Zen architecture and focused on their Polaris GPUs. The company did announce a few new processors, but nothing that could even truly come to matching Intel's offerings. Then AMD's disruptive Zen architecture debuted in February of 2017, and it was hilariously obvious how much Intel underestimated it. Intel had nothing ready to counter desktop Ryzen with its high cores and shockingly affordable price. This fact arguably led to a chain of events that saw Intel stumble at almost every possible opportunity since. At Computex 2017, Intel once again revealed higher core count chips in the form of Skylake X parts, including a monstrous Core i9, all of which were still priced ever so far out of the hands of the general consumer. At this point, there was still barely more than a mention of Coffee Lake, as Intel had to be in a mad rush to produce something, anything, to stave off AMD's new onslaught. AMD, on the other hand, was the one riding high this time around, having launched the Ryzen desktop lineup to great success and much fanfare. But the company wasn't done with Zen, as AMD revealed even more details about its Zen-based EPYC processors aimed at the server market and the Threadripper parts built for consumers that need all the power and then some. Intel tried to downplay some of what AMD had accomplished with Zen, calling the EPYC processors a series of glued together chips. Well, Intel glued together or not, there's still a better option than what you had to offer, to be quite frank. So since all of that went down, Intel released their Coffee Lake lineup and finally had that something they needed to be at least somewhat competitive with Ryzen. But in the process, Coffee Lake essentially screwed over many of Intel's own consumers, essentially making many of its higher end parts redundant and showing a certain finger to anyone who bought the Kaby Lake architecture. Even worse, the new lineup released alongside a single pricey chipset, making many of the CPUs in the Coffee Lake lineup a terrible value. It took Intel many months to release cheaper chipsets, further showing just how unprepared they were for some real competition in the market. So to say that Intel was on the back foot at this year's Computex would be an understatement. AMD has already improved on their architecture that launched them back into relevance in the form of Ryzen 2000, and they revealed at this year's conference that their upcoming EPYC and Threadripper 2 processors would be even more disruptive than the original parts. Intel yet again had nothing to counter AMD. Their 8-core Coffee Lake chip has yet to even be confirmed, and apparently all they could do to take eyes off of AMD this year was to whip up a demonstration of a 28-core CPU running at 5 gigahertz. A CPU that doesn't exist as a consumer part and probably won't for quite a while. The demonstration used cooling that was far beyond what any consumer would be able or willing to whip together. All the while, AMD announced that they're hard at work on the Threadripper 2 processor boasting up to 32 cores, which will be a real thing, and a real thing aimed directly at consumers and can be air-cooled. And if there was any confusion left about whether the tides have started shifting in AMD's favor, this year's Computex has seemingly cleared that up pretty well. Intel has been stagnant for so long that they don't seem to know how to get things moving again. They're still struggling to move their processors to smaller, more efficient processing nodes. They're actively screwing over their own consumer base with each new release, and after belittling the impact of higher core counts for so long, they've become the one chasing it and having a lot of trouble keeping up with AMD. So that's going to wrap it up on our brief history of Intel's Ryzen fall. Be sure to let us know what you think about that down in the comments. Also, let us know if we left anything out. We try to keep this as concise as possible so you can understand why the market is the way it is and why people are so upset with Intel over all of the shenanigans that they're pulling. We wanted to condense it into a square package for you. Let me know what you thought of it down in the comments down below, also by hitting that like button that's down there as well. Show support for the video. Also, please get subscribed to stay up to date on all of our tech-related content, whether it be short history pieces like this, some PC builds, our hot news series, which you should check that out right up there. That's it. That's all I have to say. I'm Brett with the UFD Tech Channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see your smiling faces again later. Cheerio.